That psalm goes right along with our children's story, doesn't it? You're probably wondering why I have the title that I have today. Yeah, I see the head shaking. Looks like a bunch of drinking birds out there. Yeah, why is mountains? But if you remember reading the very first verse in Psalm 121, I look up to the mountains from whence cometh my help. Or I look up to the hills. In Palestine, the mountains aren't mountains, they're hills. Okay, not compared to my home country of Colorado, where the mountains are really and truly mountains, right? I love mountains. I just love mountains. Growing up in Colorado, every day you could see Mount Evans, 14,000 feet on the western side of town. Mount Evans. Right behind it, hiding there, is another 14er, Mount Bierstadt. And if you're in a high place in Denver, you can look south and you can see Pikes Peak, or you look north and you can see Long's Peak, all 14,000-foot peaks. There's 52 peaks in Colorado that are 14,000 feet high, and there's a couple there that are unofficial 14ers. I've been on one of them. The reason why it's unofficial is because the dip down from a 14er to Mount Bross is not deep enough to consider Mount Bross another mountain. So I've been on that one too. But yeah, and I've been on 10 14,000-foot peaks. And I'll tell you what, I get inspired when I'm on top of a mountain. I feel, shame on me, invincible. Because climbing up those things is a real job. I remember climbing up one mountain, and I got, well, no, it happened in two different mountains. One was Mount Evans in Bierstadt, and the other one was Mount Grays. And I almost got to the top, and right, you get dizzy, not enough air, right? Not enough, well, the air isn't thick enough. And boy, I'll tell you, it's quite a job getting up there. And then when you get up there, there's a whole bunch of zealous enthusiasm that pumps through your body because you're on top of a mountain. I've been on some other mountains too. I've been on Pilatus, which is a tall mountain in Switzerland, overlooks the Vierwaldstätter See down below there. Oh, it's gorgeous. That one I didn't have to climb. I just sat down and rode all the way to the top. Mount Hood? Nope, haven't been there. I saw it. I've been around the bottom of it, but I didn't have enough time to climb it. But I've also been on Mount Nebo. Do you know what mountain that is? It's in Jordan. And Mount Nebo is where Moses saw the promised land from afar. That was an experience for me because it was a hazy day. Now, Moses, when he stood there and looked at the promised land, he could only see the promised land from afar. When I was standing there, I was thinking how I could see it, but it was all hazy, kind of like you and me looking at the promised land right now. We've got an idea of how beautiful it is, but eye hath not seen, ear hath not heard, neither has it entered into the heart of man, what God has prepared for each of us, right? So the promised land is kind of hazy. I've also been on Mount Moriah. You know, Mount Moriah is where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, right? And Mount Moriah is also called Mount Zion, and it's where Jesus was sacrificed, right? And that was an experience. I've been on Mount Olivet, Mount of Olives. I was a little disappointed because there were no mound of olives there for me to stand on top of. I'm sorry. I just can't. I can't tell myself to stop, you know? Yes, and then I've been on top of Mount Carmel. And on top of Mount Carmel is a statue of Elijah, and he's holding a sword. I thought that was surprising. I didn't really think that that would be appropriate, prophet of God holding a sword, but he did. He held a sword. So today, I would like to focus on 4 mountains. 4. 3 real mountains, and then a 4th mountain that is not real but very real. How's that for a conundrum, huh? Not real but very real. All right? And I'd like to talk about these 3 mountains, Mount Carmel, Mount Gilboa, and Mount Tabor. And they are located around the Jezreel Valley, which is about, roughly as the crow flies, 40 miles north of Jerusalem. The Kishon Brook flows to the north and out into the Mediterranean on one part of that valley, and then the other end of the valley is the Sea of Galilee. And it kind of goes at an angle like this, from up in the northwest down to the Sea of Galilee, which is the southeast. All right? And the first mountain I'd like to talk to you about is Mount Gilboa. Gilboa is a sad story because that's where King Saul and his sons were killed. And that's a sad story from not only the fact that he was killed and his sons were killed, including Jonathan, who was David's best friend, right? It's also sad from the story that's behind all that. You see, King Saul was anointed as king, and then it went to his head. He was working for a vicious tyrant called Self, and it just went to his head. He was one of the tallest guys in all of Israel, right? Head and shoulders over most everybody else. And I guess when you're that tall, you know, it goes to your head. That's why I'm kneeling down here. But, you know, he got to thinking that he was making all the decisions and so forth. And then he would ignore the counsel from the prophet Samuel. He'd just ignore it, you know. And then he got jealous of David. You see, he was anointed, and David was going to be his replacement because he was going the wrong way, right? So God anointed David. And now he's jealous of David and Goliath, and it should have been Saul that fought Goliath because he was the tallest and probably supposed to be the biggest warrior in all of Israel, right? But he didn't. He was chicken. And a little strapling, a little teenage boy comes up there and he fights Goliath and wins. And so along comes the problem of Saul being jealous of David, and a little bit later Saul wants to eliminate David. You get that? That's an oddity right there. The anointed trying to kill the anointed. David wouldn't kill Saul, but Saul wanted to kill David and eliminate any competition, right? He didn't know what God's plan was. It was just, you know, David was going to be his replacement. Not one of his sons, not Jonathan, not one of those. He didn't like that. You know, our sons go to our own head, right? We want our sons to be carbon copies of us and just a wee bit better. But that was the problem. And then the Philistine army gathered in the Jezreel Valley. Huge valley. A huge army in a very small valley. That valley is 20 miles long by 14 miles wide. That's a plain, kind of, but it's not very big. All right? And it's near the Mount Gilboa where this Philistine army masses up. And Saul is worried. But he hasn't listened to God or Samuel's now dead. And so what does Saul do? He wants word from God, but he's not listening to God when he has Samuel. And so what does he do? he wants to talk to Samuel and get his input, but Samuel's dead. So he goes to a witch. I mean, that's messed up, right? It's definitely messed up. And the witch calls up Samuel. Was that really Samuel? Now, if you are not a Seventh-day Adventist and you believe that as soon as you die you go to heaven, would God allow Samuel to come back and talk to Saul by being conjured up by a witch? Would Samuel even consent to come back being conjured up by a witch? Of course not. But we know as Seventh-day Adventists that when you die, you stay in the grave until you're called, right? And so who was that pretended to be Samuel? It was Satan, right? And did he give him a good report, a rosy report? No. He added to Saul's discouragement. It's not going to go well for you. And Saul went into battle even more discouraged than when he started out. Kind of a lesson in why consult with wizards and demons who peep and mutter, right? And Saul is killed on Mount Gilboa. Sad story, very sad story. What does Mount Gilboa represent? Defeat, disaster, falsehood, and going to the wrong place for the right information, right? Mount Gilboa represents that. Very sad. Then there's Mount Carmel. What does Mount Carmel represent? Mount Carmel is a big showdown. Oh, I love this story, don't you? We cheer and so forth when we hear that story or when we read it or when somebody's talking about it or a pastor talks about it. Mount Carmel. There's a politically and royally sanctioned religion going on in Israel. And it's a religion of idolatry, right? And not only is it the idolatry of Baal, but it's Asheroth and Asherah, I should say. And Jezebel and King Ahab are leading Israel into worshiping Baal and Asherah. Now, some people would like to say, see, it's the woman's fault. It's Jezebel that pushed Ahab into that, But, Ahab had to make a decision, didn't he? Yeah. And, boy, I'll tell you what, it's quite a story. First, there's a gigantic 3.5-year drought that Elijah tells Ahab's going to happen. 3.5 years. That's interesting, isn't it? Because we got 3.5 years popping up here and there and all over the place, right? But then there's this showdown on Mount Carmel where Elijah says, bring the prophets of Baal up on this mountain and the prophets of Asherah. There's 450 prophets of Baal that are up there and 400 prophets and priests of Asherah. And they build 2 altars, okay? The one that Elijah built had 12 stones. Why 12? These numbers are interesting, aren't they? Yeah. And then they have 2 bullocks that they're going to sacrifice, and the prophets of Baal and Asherah cut up the sacrifice and put it on their altar with wood, and they're not allowed to light it. They're supposed to let Baal or Asherah light it for them. I mean, they got twice as much possibilities as Elijah. Elijah's just got God, 1, right? But they've got 2, Asherah and Baal. Plus, there's 850 of them and one of Elijah. All right, one of their prayers might get through. Yeah, you would think, right? and he says, okay, you can't light it, but let your God light it, or your gods light it, right? And they watch him, and of course Elijah is checking them out, make sure they don't secretively light it on the backside or whatever it is, checking them out, right? And they have all day, and they're so frenetic. And of course Elijah teases them. Oh, a little louder, come on, maybe he's asleep, right? Or maybe he's on vacation, yell! He teases them. And then it comes time for Elijah, and he cuts up the sacrifice, puts it on the altar, and then he asks for water to be dumped on the sacrifice. That just is telling them, I'm going to show you something spectacular. And the water is dumped all over the sacrifice, and then he even digs a little trench around the altar so that the water is still there, right? And one single prayer, and fire comes down out of heaven, right? Consumes everything, consumes the sacrifice and the wood. That makes sense, right? But it's wet, it's soggy wet, and it doesn't, and then it consumes the rocks. The rocks burn and licks up all the water. Yeah, oh wow. And this is unmistakable. You know what Elijah was saying to the people of Israel? Why do you stand between two opinions? Why not pick the right one? Choose you this day whom you're going to serve, right? This is what he's doing with Israel, and it's unmistakable. Fire comes down out of heaven and takes and accepts the sacrifice that Elijah offers on behalf of Israel. What happened to the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah? They're taken down to the brook of Kishon, and they are killed. We don't need to have false prophets. We don't. Or priests or anything like that. That's just very sad. What does the Mount Carmel represent? It represents decision. Choose. You've got to choose. And it's an unmistakable choice, right? You've got to choose. There's no doubt at all about what's going on Mount Carmel. God is God, and there is none like him. Choose. And so Mount Carmel represents decision. Mount Carmel is on the western end of the Jezreel Valley, and now we have another mountain which is north of Gilboa on the eastern end, southern eastern end of the Jezreel Valley, and that mountain is Mount Tabor. You know what Mount Tabor is famous for? The transfiguration of Jesus. Wow, that's something else. Mount Tabor is where Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on the mountain with him, and they got to see him in all his glory. He was robed in light, right? And he talked with Moses and Elijah. Now, boy, there's a whole sermon right there, right? Moses and Elijah with Jesus on the mountain, transfigured. Guess what happened to Peter, James, and John? They were in awe, as it says in the book of Matthew, in the account in Matthew, and they were afraid, as it says in the account in Mark. They were in awe. They were in rapt attention to what's going on. One of the things I always ask myself is, how is it that Peter knew that it was Moses and Elijah? Maybe it was the discussion that was going on that they figured it out. I don't think they had any pictures of Moses and Elijah in their wallets that they would know what they looked like, but probably from the discussion that was going on. and they knew it was Moses and Elijah. Wow. Now, Moses and Elijah and Jesus, boy, this is a message. First off, Moses and Elijah represent the entirety of the Old Testament concept of covenant law and salvation. There's a sermon again, right there. The covenant law and salvation. You know, in Revelation chapter 11, we have the two witnesses. And people have said, and we also believe, that the two witnesses are the Old and the New Testament. But when Revelation was written, there was no Old and New Testament. There was just the Old Testament, right? And, you know, the parable of rich man and Lazarus, and the rich man goes down below and he needs a drink of water, and it's a fictional story, obviously, but the final thing about that parable is that the rich man wants to have Lazarus go and tell them, his relatives, the truth. And the answer comes back, if Moses and Elijah, or Moses and the prophets, were to speak to them face to face, they still wouldn't believe. That's sad. That's sad, it really is. But Moses represents the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. It's the whole Old Testament concept of salvation through covenant law, right? And covenant means sacrifice. Without sacrifice, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. And so you have the Old Testament law and sacrifice, covenant law, pointing forward to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Wow, that's really something. And there's Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. But also Moses and Elijah represent something else. Moses was resurrected. We learned that in Jude, right? Moses died near Mount Nebo, but was resurrected. Elijah, did he die? No, he was transferred in a fiery chariot. I'm jealous. You know, when I was a teenager, I wanted a GTO with flames on the side of it. You know, that's nothing compared to a fiery chariot, right? Boy, I'll tell you what. It's really something. Moses represents the resurrection, and Elijah represents translation. You know, that's our hope. Some of us may be put in the grave before Jesus comes, and we hope in the resurrection, right? And Jesus may come sooner than we think, and some of us are going to be translated because we'll see Jesus come in the clouds. And we'll be chasing down all those who've been resurrected, because they're resurrected first, and then we're lifted up to follow them, right? That is our hope. What does Mount Carmel represent? Hope. Hope. It represents hope. What else? No, that's Mount Carmel. The way I'm making this up, okay? No, salvation, hope, right? That's what it represents. That's what Carmel represents. And then there is that fourth funny mountain, the one that is not real but very real that I told you about. You see, many Christians believe that the Jezreel Valley is the valley of Armageddon. They believe that because there's a little town of Megiddo in the middle of it, and you can see pictures of it. I received from a well-meaning lady a book, a wonderful lady, called Megiddo, right here. And in there it talks about the archaeological work around Megiddo. And because Megiddo is in the middle of the Jezreel Valley, for some reason people are saying that that's the valley of Armageddon. That's what they say. When I was a kid, I was growing up in the Baptist church, and I got all kinds of stories about the Battle of Armageddon, how it was going to have blood flowing to the height of a horse's bridle, and that there's going to be all kinds of people fighting each other, and finally the good people are going to win. It's going to be a conventional warfare. Well, when I looked down from Mount Carmel in the valley of Jezreel, I realized, because of my army background, that a valley, I don't know why I did that. Why did I do that? I can't keep myself from doing bad things, right? The valley of Jezreel is not big enough for anything more than maybe 2 brigades of tanks to fight each other. It's not a place where a world conflict can be fought in conventional means. When I was in Korea, I saw an atomic weapon that would be shot out of a cannon. And it had to have the maximum number of bags of powder to blow that thing out of the cannon. And they told me that when that thing went off with all that powder, the cannon would go back like this on its top. So you had to not be standing on it when you shot it, or pull the lanyard. And it would go 20-some miles into the future because, in the distance, and it would explode, and you had to hide. 20 miles. Jezreel Valley is only 20 miles long. If that atomic weapon goes off in the last battle of Armageddon, they call it, it would blow up the whole valley. The whole valley would be messed up, radiated. Oh, man, it'd be awful. And that's just a smaller atomic weapon. A major size megaton atomic weapon would blow up much more than that. That valley is not big enough for a conventional battle of all the kings of the earth. It's not. Another thing about this is that the valley, the word Armageddon, is misunderstood completely. The word Armageddon is only mentioned once in all of the Bible. Nowhere else. And it's a portmanteau word. You know what portmanteau word is? It's a word where 2 words are put together to make one meaning. Okay? And in this particular case, Armageddon is Har-Mageddon. Har means mountain. That's why I've been calling it a mountain that isn't real, but very real. Yeah. Mountain, Har means mountain. Has a rough breather when you write it in Greek, and that's the way it was written in Revelation. And Mageddon, if you get the meaning of that word Mageddon, it means gathering or coalition. In other words, a bringing together of people. That makes an awful lot of sense because in Revelation chapter 16, it says that 3 foul spirits go out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet to gather the kings of the earth together at a place called, in the Hebrew, Armageddon. That's a gathering. That makes sense. One of the rules of biblical interpretation, one of the chief rules, is context. You have to read the whole context, not just the single word and try and apply it to a valley somewhere and say, it's a valley, when it's really a mountain, right? It doesn't make sense, right? And so you read the 6th plague, and it's a gathering. And they gather at a place called Armageddon. Is that a plague? Yes, it is. It's a plague of falsehood because it's foul spirits, unclean spirits that come out of the mouth of the dragon, which we know is Satan, right? And the beast, which is the resurrected beast that has the wound that's been healed, right? And the false prophet, which is the image of the beast that everybody's supposed to bow down to, and they're supposed to have a mark on their forehead or in their right hand, the mark of the beast. And if they don't, they can't buy or sell, and that doesn't work, so they're going to put them to death. It's not a battle between conventional forces and then one wins out and then brings in 1,000 years of peace. No. That's not what's in the Bible. Take the whole context. Chapter 16, 17, and 18 is the culmination of the end, right? And so you take the first 5 plagues mentioned in chapter 16, and they're all poured out against the beast, right, and his throne and so forth, the dragon and his throne. They're poured out against them. And then number 6 plague is a gathering of falsehood, right, of false philosophy, if you will. And then the 7th plague is what? You read it and you realize that it's quotes from all different parts of, Matthew and Mark and all the way back in the Old Testament. Every island disappears and every mountain is displaced. And there's a huge earthquake and hail the size of 100 pounds each falls from heaven. It's the end. It is finished. The wrath of God is finished with the 7th plague. When you read the first part of the 7 plagues, it says, with these 7 plagues, the wrath of God is finished. What's happening is that all the wicked who have gathered together to try and eliminate God's people, the 144,000, suddenly get caught in the middle of their act, and God rescues them. Right? It's rescue, it's salvation, it's wonderful. Let me ask you, folks, you've been told in Psalms, I look unto the mountains, or unto the hills. From whence cometh my help? It's a question mark. From whence cometh my help? So which mountain are you going to flee to? Don't go to Gilboa. That's defeat right there. All right? You could go to Mount Carmel. And I say that because if you haven't made your decision yet, you need to make your decision. There's ample evidence in this world and in the past and in prophecies fulfilled and so forth. There's ample evidence that God is real and that Jesus loves us and He did die for us on the cross. There's ample evidence. If you haven't decided, you need to decide. So you might need to go to Mount Carmel first. But which mountain should you go to? Should you go to Armageddon? That's the wrong place to go. You'd be on the wrong side, right? You'd be on the wrong side. It's going to be very difficult for us to say no and not belong to that side. Did you know that? Because, us guys, we like to provide for our families, right? And if you can't buy or sell, you're not going to be able to get your paycheck. You're not going to be able, even if you got your paycheck, you wouldn't be able to buy anything for your family, no food or whatever it is. You might have to be out in the street begging, right? And if you're begging, somebody will figure it out. Oh, you're not one of us. It's going to be a really difficult time. Jesus said it'd be so difficult that if it's not shortened, you might even lose us. That's what Jesus said. And He's going to shorten it just because He wants to save us, and He's going to come in the clouds, right? I had to laugh when I read that second stanza in We're Marching to Zion that we sang this morning. On that bright and cloudless morning, no, it's going to be very dark. And it'll be a little cloud the size of a man's fist that's white, and then it will come. And the darkness will be dispelled in that one spot only. It won't be a bright and cloudless morning. It will be a difficult time. We think that we might just be sacrificed. But we'll take hope in God, right? It's going to be a difficult time. Well, folks, I've gone on and on and on and on and on. That's what my wife says I do. We get in an argument, she says, do you go on and on and on and on and on? I don't want to hear any more of it. Right? Yeah? Oh, thank you. But I've got to move on. So I'm going to have a quick little prayer, and then I'm going to ask for you guys to sing the final song and then have the final prayer, okay? Please? But let's pray. Father, I pray your blessing upon these good people. Help them to be a part of Mount Tabor, which is the mountain of hope and salvation.